The fog hung heavy over the valley, clinging to the earth like a shroud. It drifted between tents and over sleeping men, muffling the faint crackle of campfires and the whisper of the Danube. The Ottoman camp stretched for miles, a city of canvas and wood, filled with the quiet breathing of thousands. Horses shifted in their sleep, the scent of sweat and ash rising in the still night air. All was calm yet uneasy. The soldiers had heard rumors of the Wallachian prince, of his cruelty, of the forests filled with the dead. They laughed at the tales in daylight, but under this starless sky laughter had no place. Then came the sound. It began faintly, like the echo of distant thunder. Hooves striking the earth, slow at first, then faster. The rhythm deepened until it seemed the ground itself was trembling. A few sentries peered into the mist, their torches flickering against the pale fog. Nothing moved. Then a scream tore through the silence. From the darkness riders burst forth. Cloaked in black and armor that caught the glow of the flames they carried, they fell upon the camp like a storm. Torches whirled through the air, landing on tents soaked in oil. In an instant, the Ottoman encampment became a sea of fire. The night erupted in shouts, confusion, and terror. Men stumbled from their beds, clutching swords and half-fastened armor. Orders were shouted in Turkish, in Greek, in Albanian, but the voices drowned beneath the roar of flames and the cries of the dying. The first wave of arrows hissed from the fog. They struck without pattern, cutting down men as they ran toward the horses or the riverbank. A lieutenant fell with an arrow in his throat before he could draw his blade. Another tried to mount his horse, but was dragged down by a rider cloaked in darkness, his dagger flashing once, then again. The attackers moved like phantoms. They struck and vanished, only to appear again from another direction. Their horses were smaller than Ottoman steeds, faster, trained to dart between tents and leap over obstacles. Each man carried torches, sabers, and curved spears meant for close combat. They shouted in their own tongue, harsh cries that cut through the noise. Some called out the Sultan's name, mocking it, twisting it into curses. Others shouted Dracula, and the name carried like a chill through the night air. A section of the camp collapsed as fires spread. The smoke grew thick, choking men where they stood. Shadows danced on the walls of the command tents, distorted by the light of the burning sky. Through the chaos, the Ottomans glimpsed a figure at the heart of the storm. He rode a black horse, his armor dark as iron, his helmet crowned with steel spikes. In his hand he carried a long spear, and on it hung a banner marked by a dragon's head. The symbol of the Order of the Dragon, an oath once sworn to defend Christendom. Vlad Dracula. He rode through the fire, silent, his men following close behind. They were few compared to the vast Ottoman host, yet their attack was fierce, precise, and utterly without fear. They aimed not to capture or conquer, but to terrify. Each strike was chosen to sow confusion. Officers were targeted first, their tents set ablaze before they could issue commands. Supply wagons were overturned and set on fire, horses released to trample through the camp in blind panic. The Ottomans tried to rally. Drums began to sound, but the rhythm faltered as panic spread. Some soldiers believed the Wallachians were more than men. The sight of their leader, his armor glowing red in the reflection of the flames, only deepened the terror. To them, he looked like something risen from the underworld, a dark angel of vengeance come to punish the invaders. The Sultan's tent stood near the center of the camp, guarded by his elite janissaries. Word spread quickly that the Wallachians were coming for him. The guards drew their scimitars, forming a wall of steel as the distant noise of battle drew nearer. Flames licked at the edges of the royal banners. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the screams continued. For 3 hours, the night was ruled by fire. The Wallachians struck in waves, disappearing into the fog, only to return from another side. Each time, their war cries echoed like the roar of beasts. When they finally withdrew, they left behind a camp in ruins. Thousands of men were dead, hundreds more wounded, and the survivors stumbled among the ashes. Their faces blackened with soot and fear. The sun rose slowly over the Danube, lighting the battlefield with a pale, cold glow. What had been an orderly camp now lay shattered and broken. Horses wandered aimlessly. Tents lay torn open, and bodies sprawled across the trampled mud. Smoke drifted upward, curling into the morning sky. Among the wreckage, officers searched for signs of what had happened. Some believed it had been an army of thousands. Others swore they saw demons in the fire. Yet those who had caught a glimpse of the black-armored figure knew better. They had seen a man, a prince who had turned fear itself into a weapon. As reports reached the Sultan, a grim realization spread through the Ottoman ranks. This had not been a simple raid. It was not meant to defeat them outright. It was meant to break them from within. Vlad had shown them what kind of war he would fight, one where terror, not numbers, decided victory. And so began one of the most harrowing campaigns in the history of the Balkans, where a small principality dared to defy the might of an empire by turning the darkness of the night into its deadliest ally. The flames of that night would burn long in the memories of those who survived, and the name Vlad Dracula would echo in their dreams, whispered with fear long after the fires were gone. As dawn rose over the smouldering Ottoman camp, few understood the man behind the terror. The soldiers who survived whispered his name in fear, yet none truly knew who he was or what had shaped him. To them, Vlad Dracula was a monster born from darkness, a figure too cruel to be human. But his story had begun far from the battlefield, in a land of mountains, stone fortresses, and endless struggle between empires. Vlad III of Wallachia was born in the winter of 1431, in the ancient region of Transylvania. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood of nobles sworn to defend Christendom against the expanding power of the Ottoman Empire. The name Dracula came from the Latin Draco, meaning dragon. It symbolized the sacred duty to stand against the infidel and preserve the faith. In time, his son would be known as Dracula, which meant son of the dragon. What began as a symbol of honor would one day become a name drenched in blood and legend. Wallachia, his homeland, lay at the crossroads of two worlds. To the north, the Kingdom of Hungary held sway, watching the Carpathian passes with suspicion and greed. To the south, the Ottoman Empire stretched across the Balkans like a rising tide, swallowing one principality after another. Wallachia stood between them, a small land that both powers sought to control. Its rulers survived by cunning, tribute, and sometimes treachery. It was a land where princes rose and fell by the will of foreign kings. Vlad's father, seeking to preserve his throne, entered into uneasy alliances with both sides. When Sultan Mehmed II demanded loyalty, he offered it, even sending two of his sons as hostages to guarantee his obedience. Vlad was still a boy when he and his younger brother Radu were taken to the Ottoman court. They were not prisoners in chains, but hostages of diplomacy, held to ensure their father's cooperation. The Ottoman court at Edirne was a world unlike anything Vlad had known. The architecture gleamed with marble and gold, the air heavy with incense, and the murmur of scholars. Here he learned the Turkish language, the art of horseback archery, and the complex etiquette of imperial power. Yet beneath the splendor lay cruelty. Punishments were swift and merciless. Betrayal was answered with execution. Vlad watched as slaves were beaten and prisoners impaled along the roads. He learned early that fear could govern more completely than law. For Radu, life in captivity was gentler. Handsome and charming, he adapted easily to the Ottoman world. He befriended the young Mehmed, the future conqueror of Constantinople, and grew comfortable in the palace's luxury. In time, he came to see the Ottomans not as captors but as patrons. Vlad was different. He was proud, suspicious, and unbending. Each day in the Sultan's court filled him with bitterness. He studied his captors not with admiration but with hatred. Where Radu saw opportunity, Vlad saw only humiliation. These years forged his nature. He learned how the Ottomans thought, how they organized their armies, and how they used terror to keep provinces in line. He saw that fear was a weapon more effective than any sword. It burned longer than courage and silenced rebellion before it began. When he returned home, he would wield that weapon himself. While Vlad endured captivity, tragedy unfolded in Wallachia. His father, caught between Ottoman demands and Hungarian influence, was betrayed by his own nobles. In 1447, Vlad II Dracula and Vlad's elder brother Mircea were murdered by boyars who sided with Hungary. Their bodies were left unburied, their deaths a message to all who defied foreign will. Word of this reached Vlad in the Ottoman court, and from that moment, vengeance took root in him. He was released a few years later, after a brief attempt by the Ottomans to install him as a pliant ruler in Wallachia. His first reign was short and uncertain, but it marked the beginning of his transformation. The boy, who had once been a hostage, had learned to play the game of survival. He now understood that pity had no place in power. Every gesture, every punishment, every show of strength would have to serve a purpose. Wallachia itself was a fractured land. The nobility was treacherous, shifting allegiance between Hungary and the Ottomans, depending on which side seemed stronger. Peasants lived under the burden of endless taxes and raids. The land's rulers were expected to serve as both warriors and diplomats, balancing on a knife's edge between two empires that demanded tribute and loyalty. Any weakness could invite invasion or rebellion. Vlad's father had tried to rule by compromise and had died for it. His son would not make the same mistake. When Vlad finally reclaimed his throne in 1456, the boyars expected another weak prince who would bow to foreign power. Instead, they found a man shaped by humiliation and vengeance. The lessons of his youth in the Ottoman court had burned away any trace of mercy. He had learned to mimic the methods of empire on a smaller scale, turning his principality into a realm of absolute control. He believed that only fear could bring unity to a land divided by greed and betrayal. And so he ruled with iron resolve. Those who defied him were punished not quietly but publicly. Their deaths transformed into symbols of his power. It was a language everyone could understand. To the nobles it was a warning. To the peasants it was justice. To his enemies beyond the border it was a message written in blood. But behind the brutality lay method. Vlad's use of terror was not madness, though his enemies often called it so. It was a deliberate instrument of rule, refined by years of observation. He had watched the Sultan command loyalty through dread and decided that he could do the same. Where the Ottomans had armies of thousands, Vlad had only fear, sharpened into a weapon he could wield with precision. The boy who once trembled in a foreign court had returned home as a man who would make others tremble in turn. He had learned the power of spectacle, of symbols that lingered in the mind long after the act was done. In the lands of the Danube, his name began to spread once again, not as a prince but as a force. The stories of his vengeance grew with each retelling, and his legend began to eclipse the man himself. In the shadow of two great empires, Vlad Dracula forged his own path. He was neither servant nor ally to those who sought to control him. His rule would be one of isolation, fear, and unyielding will. To his enemies, he was the devil of Wallachia. To his people, he was the only man strong enough to keep the wolves at bay. The dragon that had once symbolized his father's oath had taken on new meaning. It no longer represented chivalry or faith, but the dark strength needed to survive in a world of endless conquest. In Vlad, the dragon had found its shadow, and that shadow would soon fall across the greatest empire of its age. The Ottoman soldiers, who awoke to the fires of his night attack, had seen only the result of years of pain and learning. Behind the terror stood a man who had studied the art of fear in captivity and turned it into his creed. The boy who had once been powerless had learned the truth that empires feared most. Power was not taken by numbers or wealth, but by the mastery of fear itself. And Vlad Dracula had mastered it completely. When Vlad Dracula reclaimed his throne in 1456, Wallachia was a broken land. Years of shifting rulers, invasions, and betrayals had left the principality divided. The boyars, who had plotted against his father, still held great power. Corruption filled the court, and the countryside suffered from raids, famine, and fear. The throne of Wallachia was not a seat of majesty, but a target for knives, daggers, and foreign ambition. Vlad knew that if he was to rule, he could not rely on loyalty or mercy. He would have to create order from chaos, and he would do it through fear. His first acts as ruler were swift and merciless. He summoned the boyars who had supported his father's murder to a great feast in the capital of Targoviste. The nobles arrived in splendid clothing, bringing their wives and servants, unaware that their prince had already judged them guilty. As they dined, Vlad's soldiers sealed the doors. When the last toast was raised, the hall fell silent. Vlad stood and accused them of treason, of betrayal, of feasting on the ruin of Wallachia. Some protested, others pleaded, but his sentence was already decided. The elderly were impaled outside the city walls. The rest were marched north toward the mountains and forced to build his new fortress at Poenari. Few survived the journey. This act sent shockwaves through the land. The message was clear: no treachery would go unpunished. The nobles who remained alive bent their knees in submission, and the common people, long oppressed by feudal cruelty, saw a new kind of justice taking shape. Vlad's rule would not favor the rich or the privileged. It would favor obedience. Under his command, Wallachia became a land of discipline. Roads were patrolled, laws were enforced, and thieves were hunted without mercy. There are tales of a golden cup placed in the town square of Targoviste, left unguarded by the well. It remained untouched for years, for none dared to steal under Vlad's rule. Punishment for theft was death by impalement, the same punishment used for murder, treason, and betrayal. To his enemies it was barbaric. To his supporters it was justice without corruption. Impalement became the symbol of his reign. The method was cruel and slow, but its horror was the very reason it worked. Victims were bound and impaled on long wooden stakes, sometimes through the chest, sometimes through the abdomen, left to die over the course of hours or days. The sight of these bodies lining the roads and city gates served as both warning and lesson. For Vlad, it was not merely punishment but performance. Each execution was a statement that no sin, no disobedience would escape his gaze. Foreign envoys who visited Wallachia recorded what they saw with horror. A papal emissary wrote that the land seemed cursed, filled with the smell of death and decay. Saxon merchants traveling from Transylvania spread stories that chilled the courts of Europe. They spoke of hills covered with stakes, each bearing the body of a traitor, a thief, or an enemy soldier. They described Vlad as a ruler possessed by rage, yet others noted that his realm was strangely peaceful. Crime had vanished, trade routes were safe, and peasants worked their fields without fear of bandits. The price of this peace was terror. The Saxons, who had long dominated trade in the region, soon felt his wrath as well. When they sided with his rivals and spread slander against him, he responded with fire. Towns that defied his rule were raided and burned, their leaders impaled at the gates. One captured Saxon envoy described rows upon rows of bodies, some freshly impaled, others decaying in the sun. The forests themselves seemed to bristle with wooden stakes, each one bearing a warning to those who might betray him. This became known as the Forest of the Impaled. To the Ottomans, this display was both terrifying and familiar. They understood the use of fear as a political tool, but Vlad's application of it was on a different scale. Where the Sultan used executions to enforce law, Vlad used them to build legend. His cruelty was deliberate, aimed not only at his enemies, but at the imagination of all who heard his name. He understood that terror traveled faster than armies. A soldier could kill 100 men, but fear could paralyze thousands. One foreign observer described meeting Vlad in person. He was not a madman, as the stories suggested, but calm, composed, and articulate. He spoke of his country's suffering, of the corruption of the nobles, and of the endless greed of foreign powers. He defended his brutality as necessary medicine for a diseased land. "What is mercy," he asked, "to a land that knows only betrayal?" His reasoning was cold, his conviction absolute. He ruled not out of madness, but from a belief that cruelty, when used with purpose, could restore order where kindness had failed. The results were undeniable. Within a few short years, Wallachia transformed from a divided principality into a stable and obedient state. Bandits vanished, roads became safe for travel, and peasants began to harvest in peace. Merchants feared his temper, but respected the safety of his lands. Even the powerful Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus viewed Vlad with a mix of admiration and concern. A man who could impose such control over a chaotic land was both valuable and dangerous. Yet Vlad's methods created as many enemies as they did followers. The boyars who survived his purges whispered against him, and the Saxon cities of Transylvania plotted revenge. Foreign courts painted him as a monster, a tyrant who delighted in blood. The truth was more complex. Vlad had discovered that in an age ruled by force, mercy was seen as weakness. To protect his people and his throne, he became what others feared. He turned cruelty into a language that his enemies understood, one written in the silence that follows horror. The forest of the impaled became his masterpiece of psychological warfare. When entire Ottoman battalions were captured during raids, Vlad ordered them impaled outside the capital. The rows of bodies stretched for miles, an ocean of death swaying in the wind. Birds circled above, and the air reeked of decay. The Sultan's scouts who rode ahead of his armies carried back tales of this vision, spreading panic before battle even began. Soldiers refused to march forward, claiming that no mortal could face such a ruler and survive. To those who saw it, the sight defied understanding. It was not the act of a savage, but of a strategist. Vlad understood that fear weakens the will before battle begins. The impaled bodies were not trophies but weapons, each one whispering a single message: this is the price of defiance. Over time, his legend began to take on a life of its own. In the taverns of Europe, travelers told stories of the Impaler Prince who ruled with fire and stake, who drank the blood of his enemies and dined among the dead. In Hungary he was feared. In Rome he was condemned. But in the villages of Wallachia, old men spoke of him with a quiet respect. He had brought justice, however cruel, and defended their land from invaders who saw them as nothing more than spoils of war. By the late 1450s, Vlad's name had spread across the continent. To some he was a tyrant, to others a savior. But to his people, he was something far simpler and more real. He was the prince who made the powerful tremble. He was the ruler who demanded obedience and gave stability in return. His reign was carved into the memory of Europe, not through peace or wealth, but through the power of terror. The boy who had once been a hostage in the Ottoman court had mastered the lesson of empire. Fear ruled more effectively than love, and its echoes lasted longer than any victory on the battlefield. In the heart of the Carpathians, under the shadow of his iron rule, Vlad Dracula became more than a man. He became the embodiment of dread itself, a reminder that order can sometimes be born from terror, and that legends are not made by mercy, but by the fear they leave behind. The fires of Constantinople had barely cooled when Sultan Mehmed II turned his gaze north. In 1453, he had taken the greatest city in the world, ending an empire that had stood for 1,000 years. The world called him Mehmed the Conqueror, and for good reason. His armies had swept through the Balkans, across Anatolia, and into the heart of Europe itself. Princes bowed to him, kingdoms paid tribute, and even the might of Venice trembled at his fleets. Yet beyond the Danube lay one small land that refused submission. Wallachia, ruled by Vlad Dracula, stood like a thorn in the flesh of his empire. Wallachia had long been a vassal of the Ottomans, bound by tribute and obedience. Vlad's father had paid gold each year and sent soldiers to fight in the Sultan's wars. But Vlad III was not his father. When Mehmed demanded tribute, the answer was defiance. When Ottoman envoys arrived to collect taxes, Vlad had them executed, claiming that they had insulted him by refusing to remove their turbans in his presence. Their bodies were left on stakes outside the palace walls, a direct challenge to the Sultan's authority. The insult alone might have been tolerated. The Sultan had dealt with arrogant princes before, but Vlad's next actions crossed the line between rebellion and war. In the winter of 1461, Wallachian troops crossed the Danube under cover of darkness. They moved silently through snow and forest, striking deep into Ottoman territory. Villages burned, garrisons were slaughtered, and supply depots destroyed. Men, women, and soldiers alike were killed without mercy. Vlad's soldiers carried fire and fear wherever they went. By the time Ottoman commanders realized what had happened, entire regions north of the Balkan Mountains had been emptied. The Danube froze with corpses, and the smoke of burning towns rose into the winter sky. Reports reached Istanbul that the Wallachian prince had killed more than 20,000 subjects of the Sultan. Mehmed read the reports in silence. He was not a man easily angered, but he understood insult. This was not the act of a defiant noble. It was a declaration of war. Mehmed began to prepare his response. The Ottoman Empire at that time was one of the most powerful forces on earth. From the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, his banners flew. His armies were disciplined, battle-hardened, and guided by centuries of conquest. The Janissaries, his elite corps, were the best-trained soldiers of the age, armed with muskets and steel forged in the workshops of Bursa. Behind them came the Sipahi cavalry, the artillery corps, and legions of engineers, laborers, and supply trains. When the Sultan marched, he did not bring an army. He brought a world in motion. By the spring of 1462, more than 100,000 men had gathered along the Danube. The force included tens of thousands of regular troops, janissaries and cavalry, as well as tens of thousands more in supporting roles. Horses, camels, oxen, and siege engines followed. At the center of this vast host rode Mehmed himself, clad in armor of silver and gold, surrounded by his guards and banners. His command tent alone was larger than a noble's house, its silken walls marked by the star and crescent. The Ottoman army crossed the Danube like a tide. Wherever they went, the land trembled. Villages emptied and peasants fled into the forests. The ground shook beneath the march of soldiers, and the roads were lined with wagons carrying food, weapons, and powder. To those who watched from the hills, it seemed as if the earth itself was moving south to north, a living creature made of men, steel, and purpose. Vlad knew he could not face such a force in open battle. His army numbered barely 30,000, and most were peasant levies or light cavalry. But he knew the land better than any man alive. He knew its rivers, its mountains, its narrow valleys, and the forests that could swallow an army whole. While the Ottomans advanced with confidence, Vlad prepared the ground. He ordered villages burned, wells poisoned, and fields stripped of crops. His people retreated into the mountains, leaving nothing behind that could feed or shelter the invaders. The Sultan's armies found only silence. Towns that should have been filled with life stood empty, their houses abandoned and their stores destroyed. Scouts who rode ahead vanished into the woods, never to return. By day, the sun glared down on endless fields of ash. By night, the soldiers heard the sounds of flutes, drums, and laughter echoing from the trees. They were never sure if they were hearing men or ghosts. Vlad's strategy was simple but devastating. He knew the Ottomans relied on supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles. By destroying everything before them, he forced them to carry their own food and water, slowing their advance. He struck at night, using small bands of horsemen who appeared from the forests, attacked with fire and arrows, and disappeared before dawn. Entire Ottoman detachments vanished without trace. The Sultan's generals urged him to turn back, but Mehmed pressed forward. He was determined to crush Vlad personally, to make an example of him before all of Europe. Yet as the army advanced deeper into Wallachia, morale began to crumble. The nights grew colder, the forests thicker, and the roads more treacherous. The scent of decay filled the air. At every village they entered, they found signs of horror. Corpses nailed to gates, heads displayed on spikes, Messages carved into wood, warning that death waited ahead. The further they marched, the more they understood that they were fighting not an army, but a nightmare. Vlad's forces struck like shadows. They cut off scouts, ambushed supply convoys, and left mutilated prisoners behind for the survivors to find. The fear that spread among the Ottoman ranks did more damage than any sword. Soldiers began to whisper that the Wallachian prince was not a man, but a spirit sent to punish them. Still, Mehmed pressed onward. His pride would not allow retreat. He ordered his men to light the night with torches, to banish the darkness that seemed alive around them. The forests glowed with the light of 1,000 fires, but beyond the glow, the shadows moved. Every flicker of flame revealed strange figures watching from the trees. Sometimes arrows came from nowhere, striking men as they slept. Sometimes heads were found on stakes outside the perimeter, placed there silently in the dark. Vlad's war was one of exhaustion and fear. He could not defeat the Sultan's army in battle, but he could make every mile of their advance a torment. The Ottomans began to suffer from hunger and disease. Horses died, wagons broke down, and soldiers deserted. When they reached the outskirts of Târgoviște, they believed victory was near. Instead, they found a horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the mighty army of the Crescent marched through the silent ruins of Wallachia, confident in its power, yet haunted by something unseen. In the quiet spaces between the drumbeats, they could almost hear whispers in the wind, the sound of hooves in the distance. The echo of laughter that did not belong to the living. Vlad Dracula waited for them in the darkness ahead. He had no illusions of victory through strength. His weapon was not the sword, but the mind. As Mehmed's legions moved closer to his heartland, they were already walking into the trap he had spent months preparing. The march of the Crescent had begun, but the land itself had turned against the invaders. In the heart of the Carpathian night, every shadow belonged to Vlad. The air was heavy with heat and silence on the night of June 17th, 1462. The Ottoman camp near Târgoviște stretched for miles, a vast sea of tents under the dark sky. The Danube shimmered faintly in the distance, and the moon hid behind drifting clouds. Inside the camp, thousands of soldiers slept, their armor stacked beside them, their fires reduced to embers. The air carried the smell of sweat, smoke, and horses. To the weary soldiers, the stillness felt like a blessing after weeks of forced marches and endless fear. None of them knew that within hours that silence would turn to horror. Far beyond the edge of the camp, in the forests of Wallachia, another army moved. Vlad Dracula sat astride his horse, his face hidden beneath a steel helm shaped like a dragon's snout. Around him waited thousands of riders, their armor darkened, their torches extinguished. Not a sound came from them, except the restless snort of horses and the clink of metal as weapons shifted. They had gathered in the dead of night, answering their prince's call for vengeance. Each man knew the plan: to strike deep into the Ottoman camp, kill as many as possible, and if fate allowed, slay the Sultan himself. Vlad's scouts had returned hours earlier with precise details. The camp's outer defenses were light. The Sultan's grand pavilion stood in the center, guarded by janissaries and surrounded by officers' tents. Vlad studied the map scratched into the dirt with a dagger. His voice was calm but sharp as iron. "We strike here," he said, pointing toward the heart of the enemy camp. "We ride through their sentries, burn their tents, and kill their officers before they know what has happened. Our banners will carry the sign of the crescent to cause confusion. They will think their own men have turned against them." His captains nodded. They had seen their prince's mind at work before. Vlad did not fight with numbers. He fought with terror and precision. Tonight, every man under his command was a weapon of fear. Before they rode out, Vlad raised his sword toward the dark sky. "Remember who you are," he told them. "You are sons of this land. They have come to enslave your homes, your wives, your children. Show them that Wallachia bows to no empire. Ride with fire in your hearts and the night as your cloak." Then, without ceremony, he lowered his arm. and the army began to move. Thousands of horses advanced through the forest in silence, their hooves muffled by damp earth. The night was thick and airless, the stars hidden by cloud. Every man carried a torch wrapped in pitch and a bundle of kindling at his side. At the signal, they would set the camp aflame. Vlad rode at the front, his black armor absorbing what little light touched it, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of Ottoman watchfires. As they neared the camp, they could hear faint voices, guards speaking in Turkish, the shuffle of feet, the creak of wagon wheels. The Ottomans were unaware that death was already upon them. Vlad gave the signal with a raised hand. The riders fanned out into 3 columns, each led by one of his trusted captains. His own column would aim for the Sultan's tent. The others would strike the flanks, spreading confusion and fire. When they reached the edge of the camp, Vlad spurred his horse forward. The first sentries saw movement and raised their torches, but before they could shout, they were cut down. The Wallachians poured in like a flood. Within moments, the quiet of the night shattered. The first cries rang out as torches were hurled into tents. Fire burst across the camp, spreading like lightning through dry canvas. Horses screamed and broke free of their tethers, trampling men in their panic. The flames leapt higher, illuminating faces twisted in terror. Ottoman soldiers stumbled from their tents, half-dressed, reaching for weapons that were no longer where they had left them. Then came the sound of the horns. Wallachian war horns bellowed from 3 sides, and the riders charged through the narrow lanes between tents, cutting down anything that moved. Vlad rode at the front, his sword flashing in the firelight. His men struck fast and without mercy, their sabers cleaving through armor and flesh alike. To the Ottomans, it felt as if the end of the world had come. Fire rained from every side. Arrows hissed through the smoke. Men shouted orders that no one could hear. Some believed the Wallachians numbered in the hundreds of thousands. So complete was their confusion. In truth, they were only a few thousand. But the night made them seem infinite. Inside his command tent, Sultan Mehmed II was awakened by the chaos. He emerged, surrounded by his guards, to find the camp in flames. The air was filled with the screams of men and animals, the clashing of steel, and the crack of burning wood. For a moment, even the conqueror himself was struck silent by the scale of the attack. His commanders rushed to him, shouting that the Wallachians had infiltrated the camp. Mehmed ordered the Janissaries to form a defensive ring, protecting the royal pavilion. Vlad's riders had already reached the inner lines. They hacked through sleeping soldiers and burning tents, cutting down anyone who resisted. One of Vlad's captains, disguised in a captured Ottoman cloak, led a small band toward the Sultan's tent. But as they approached, the Janissaries met them with musket fire. Bullets tore through the smoke, killing horses and men alike. The attack faltered, and Vlad himself rode into the line to drag the survivors back. The Sultan's guards held firm, but the rest of the camp descended into madness. Officers were slain before they could rally their troops. Camels stampeded, wagons overturned, and powder stores exploded, sending fireballs into the air. In the glow of the inferno, Wallachian riders appeared like phantoms. They screamed the names of their enemies, their faces lit by flame, their armor drenched in blood. One Ottoman chronicler later wrote that it was not a battle, but a nightmare come to life. The fire made the night bright as day, and in the flickering light, shadows danced like demons. No one knew where the enemy was. Some soldiers attacked their own in confusion, mistaking them for Wallachians wearing stolen uniforms. Vlad's men pressed the attack for hours. They struck at the center, then vanished into the smoke, only to appear again at another edge of the camp. Their movements were calculated to make the Ottomans believe they were surrounded. Every few moments, a new part of the camp would erupt in flame. The noise was deafening, the constant clash of metal, the shouts in Turkish and Romanian, the thunder of hooves. Somewhere near the center, the Sultan's tent stood surrounded by a ring of spears and shields. Mehmed watched as messengers stumbled toward him covered in soot and blood, reporting that thousands were dead and that the Wallachians were inside the perimeter. For the first time, the Sultan felt the sting of fear. His empire had faced countless enemies, but none had dared strike at him personally in the dead of night. Vlad came within a few hundred paces of the Sultan's tent. His sword dripped with blood, his horse streaked with ash. He could see the royal pavilion through the haze, but the Janissaries were ready. They advanced in tight formation, their muskets raised. The crack of gunfire split the air, and several of Vlad's riders fell. He knew he could not break through their line. The Sultan was too well guarded, and dawn was approaching. Vlad wheeled his horse and signaled the retreat. His men began to pull back, still striking wherever they could. As they withdrew, they set more fires, leaving the camp in ruin. Behind them, the Ottomans tried to regroup, but the damage was done. The smell of burned flesh filled the air, and the cries of the dying echoed across the plain. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the battlefield revealed its full horror. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded among the ashes. Tents still smoldered. Horses wandered aimlessly, their riders gone. The Danube glimmered red in the morning light. Mehmed surveyed the devastation in silence. His army had survived, but its spirit had been broken. He had faced many enemies, but none who struck so deep, so ruthlessly, or with such precision. Vlad's forces disappeared back into the forest before the sun was fully risen. They left behind no trace but the smoke rising from the Ottoman camp. The Sultan ordered his men to pursue, but they found only burned bridges and empty roads. The Wallachian prince had vanished into the shadows from which he came. For days afterward, the Ottoman soldiers whispered about that night. Some said they had seen Vlad himself riding through the fire, untouched by flame or blade. Others swore that the devil had led the attack. Even Mehmed admitted that what he had faced was not mere rebellion, but the embodiment of terror itself. The night attack of Târgovişte became legend. It did not end the war, but it shattered the invincibility of the Ottoman army. The Sultan soon withdrew from Wallachia, unwilling to chase an enemy who fought like a ghost. Vlad had achieved what no army of his size should have done. He had turned fear into a weapon so sharp that even an empire bled from it. As the smoke cleared and the carrion birds gathered, the land fell silent once again. Wallachia stood, scarred but unbroken. In the heart of that silence, the name of Vlad Dracula carried on the wind, not as a man, but as a shadow that had burned itself into history. The sun rose over the plains of Wallachia, dim and grey, its light struggling to pierce the haze of smoke that still hung from the night before. The Ottoman camp was a ruin of ash and silence. Men wandered like ghosts among the wreckage, searching for their comrades, dragging the wounded from heaps of burned tents. The smell of blood and charred flesh clung to everything. Yet Sultan Mehmed II gave the order to march. He would not allow the world to say that the conqueror had been driven back by shadows. The Ottoman army began its slow advance toward Târgovişte, the Wallachian capital. Scouts rode ahead, expecting ambushes in the woods. Every sound made them flinch, every shadow seemed alive. They found burned villages, poisoned wells, and empty fields, but no sign of Vlad's army. The road was eerily quiet. Then, as they neared the outskirts of the city, the wind shifted, carrying with it a stench so foul that even the hardened soldiers began to gag. When the vanguard reached the crest of a hill, they stopped. Ahead of them lay a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The road to Târgovişte was lined with stakes, thousands of them. Each one bore a corpse, men, women, soldiers and peasants alike, their bodies twisted in death, their faces frozen in agony. The stakes stretched for miles, a forest of the dead. Some had been impaled weeks before, their flesh blackened by the sun. Others were fresh, still dripping with blood. Crows circled above, their cries echoing through the still air. The Ottoman soldiers could not look away. Many fell to their knees and began to pray. Others turned away sickened. Even the horses refused to move forward. When Sultan Mehmed arrived, he sat in silence, staring at the field before him. His commanders waited for orders, but none came. He had seen battlefields covered in corpses before, but never anything like this. The sheer scale of it was beyond imagination. Estimates vary, but Ottoman chroniclers claimed there were more than 20,000 bodies. Each one was placed deliberately, creating a grotesque display of horror and defiance. For a long time, the Sultan said nothing. Then he murmured quietly to his officers that one could not take a country from a man capable of such acts. He knew that this was no random cruelty. It was a weapon. Vlad had turned terror into art and death into a message. Every impaled body spoke the same words: "You may conquer my land, but you will never conquer my will." The Ottoman army lingered only a short while longer. The men refused to march through the forest of corpses, and the generals feared disease would spread. Within days, Mehmed gave the order to retreat. The army withdrew south, back toward the Danube. Wallachia had been reduced to ashes, but Vlad Dracula still ruled it. Against all logic, the prince had forced one of the greatest empires in history to turn back. For Vlad, the victory was temporary. Within a year, his political enemies in Hungary and Wallachia turned against him. He was captured, imprisoned, and eventually betrayed. His rule ended as violently as it began. Yet the shadow of his deeds remained. To the people of Western Europe, news of Vlad's defiance spread like wildfire. In the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, he was hailed as a hero who had stood against the Turks when others trembled. Pamphlets and woodcuts depicted him as the savior of Christendom, the man who held back the crescent with fire and blood. But those same stories also carried the darker side of his legend. They told of his cruelty, his impalements, his thirst for vengeance. To many, he became not a hero, but a monster. As centuries passed, his name transformed. Vlad Dracula became Dracula, a figure of myth and terror. Writers and storytellers reshaped him into something beyond human, a creature who fed not on victory, but on fear itself. Yet beneath those layers of legend lay a truth far more haunting. Vlad the Impaler was not a beast of fantasy. He was a man who understood his world better than most. He saw that power did not come from armies alone. It came from the fear that lived in the minds of men. When Mehmed the Conqueror rode away from Wallachia, he left behind a land drenched in blood and silence. The stakes rotted, the bodies turned to dust, but the message endured. As night falls once more over the Carpathians, the wind moves through the empty fields where the forest of corpses once stood. It whispers the name of a prince who fought empires with fire, iron, and terror. Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, remains not in flesh but in legend. His story lingers in the cold air, a reminder that some rulers seek glory through honor and others through fear. And sometimes it is fear that endures the longest.